All right, good morning. So Miss McCrae's got I'm getting over a cold, so my voice sounds a little rough, so just bear with me. Today we're going to talk about the Cold War in the 1960s. And so your essential question today is what happened during the 1960s that affected the Cold War. If you want your topic, I would put Cold War here, 1960s next to it. So, you guys remember that we talked the other day about the Berlin Wall, or Berlin in general, being divided into quadrants taken care of by the Allied forces. Well, East Berlin is going to be controlled by the Soviets, and Berlin is located in East Germany. So what's going to end up happening is that overnight the East Germany builds the wall through Berlin that divides it from the democracy side to the communist side. This went on from August 12th to 13th, 1961. Here's the issue. The reason why the Soviets built the wall is because they used it to prevent skilled workforce from escaping to the West. Nobody wants to be under communism. Nobody wants to live in East Germany, especially when you have West Germany and West Berlin on the other side. So it's heavily guarded, and it's a symbol of communism. So if you look here at this image, this is them erecting the Berlin Wall. And so what you have to understand is it's very similar to the demilitarized zone. Like, you don't cross over if you're in the eastern part because it's communist. Just like in North Korea, North Koreans can't cross over the DMZ. And let's be real, West Germans are not going to want to cross over. And the sad thing about this is that families are going to be divided because remember, this is a whole city. So they divide the city in half. So if your family lives on the East Berlin side, you're not going to get to see your family anymore. So here's what it looked like. We have East Berlin here, West Berlin, French sector, American sector, and the British sector. So remember, that's how we divided Berlin into these sections. And then the other side is the Soviets. So you could not cross over this wall that ran all the way through the city. Now, the access routes from Berlin to the west, you had a couple of railways and airways. But remember that they're not going to want people to cross over the wall. So we've got to talk about Cuba, because Cuba kind of rocks and rolls in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So in 1959, before Castro takes place, because I know you all know who Castro is, pre-revolution, there was a dictatorship under Batista. Now, Batista was supported by the United States. We liked Batista. He kept Cuba in control. Fidel Castro is going to create a revolution, or like a guerrilla. He's going to use guerrilla warfare, and he's going to create his own army. And he's going to start this armed revolt against Batista. Now, Castro wanted to end the reign of the dictator who was supported by the United States. And so what's going to end up happening is we're going to be stressed by this because Castro likes communism, and Cuba is 700 miles away from the coast of the United States. We don't have time for a country to be communist this close to us. So Fidel's going to be successful, and eventually he's going to establish a communist party in China, or in Cuba, excuse me. So what's going to end up happening is that he's going to establish a centrally planned economy under communism, and Cuba is going to begin to form close ties with the Soviet Union. Now, my question to you, and you need to write this in your notes, Cuba and the Soviet Union share a common bond of communism. So how do you think this could affect the United States? Give yourself 1 minute, write down how you think it could affect the United States. Now, by 1961, we're going to have the Bay of Pigs incident, where the U.S. government, we want to overthrow Castro, and so this is what we did. There were 1,500 Cubans, men who had escaped Cuba, so we decided to secretly train them with the government, and we came on shore at the Bay of Pigs, and the goal was to assassinate Castro. Now, the reason that we used 1,500 Cubans is because they were familiar with the land and they knew the layout of the country. Unfortunately, this was unsuccessful. You need to make sure that you go back and watch this video clip. It's very excellent about the Bay of Pigs. Now, my question to you is, we're getting ready to storm this beach in Cuba. We try to kill Fidel Castro, and it's unsuccessful. And many of these Cuban men are killed. So how do you think Fidel Castro is going to respond to our mission, our attack? And during this time, Kennedy was president. So by 1962, in October, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, after the Bay of Pigs, we're full-blown, I would say full-blown enemies of Cuba. Cuba's our enemy as well, and they get real close with the Soviet Union. So, we decide to spy over Cuba, which I know you're not surprised about because that's like how we roll. And so what they do is when they fly over Cuba, they see missiles, missile sites, and warhead bunkers in Cuba. So it ends up being about a 2-week standoff of us trying to make a resolution or to work through what can we do about these missiles because they're pointed towards the United States. If you look at this map right here, and you see Florida, and then you see Cuba, 700 miles apart. Just 700 miles. These missiles would not just affect Florida. They would have probably obliterate the whole east coast of the United States if they'd use them. So here are the solutions. The Soviets are going to remove the missiles out of Cuba. The U.S., we have missiles in Turkey. And so the Soviets say, get your missiles out of Turkey. And so this is when the Washington-Moscow hotline is established, where they communicate with each other. And there's an excellent movie called 13 Days that talks about Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy dealing with Khrushchev, who is the leader during this time of the Soviet Union, and Castro with the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you take a look here, you can look at the map. These are unidentified missiles, surface-to-air missile sites, jet fighter fields. So pretty much Cuba was just rocking and rolling and had lots of weapons. And so these are kind of top secret paperwork. And if you look here, just realizing how far these missiles could affect the United States because of how close Cuba is. So Cuba's right here. And then when you look, you've got Atlanta. They're thinking it would reach even out to St. Louis. So that's most of your east and south, southwest or southeast. All right, here's some images here. So the United States here this is the UN discussing and making plans during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is Fidel Castro and Khrushchev, who's the leader of the Soviets, hugging. And then there's John F. Kennedy, giving a speech to the American public. So, luckily, we'll move the missiles out, and there will be a bit of a resolution, but the Cold War is still going to continue. So, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is going to last from 1954 to 1975. You remember that I talked to you previously about the French ruling in Vietnam, and during that time they called it the French Indochina. Well, once they left, the country was divided north to south. The north was communist, the south was allied with the west, so that was the United States and West Europe, so like France and Britain. So the South's leader is going to be Diem. Diem is a leader in the South, and he wants, they cancel his election due to the fear of communism because they're scared that in the South they'll elect a communist leader. And so later he will eventually be assassinated, backed by the CIA, or the CIA will assist in him being assassinated so that the United States can help take over power fully. But what's going to end up happening is a civil war is going to break out in Vietnam. The U.S. is going to invoke the domino containment theory and got involved because we're like, oh my God, the South is going to fall to communism. We can't allow this to happen. That'll give the Soviets more power. So we got involved to prevent the spread of communism. Unfortunately, it's not going to be an easy war for us, and a lot of times it's considered a loss for us because of several factors like the geography, the relationships with the people, the death count. And also, this was the first televised war, so it's a very big deal. So eventually, with no victory in sight, we spent so much time over there in the jungle. We were not familiar with the jungle or the outlay or the layout of Vietnam. Also, there was wildlife that we had not experienced, and then also the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were the communists that were present in South Vietnam and even North, because the North was communist. And so those would be individuals that we would walk by during the day, and they'd be working on their farms. And we walk through their town or village, and later they would be the ones attacking us. So it was very difficult to decipher who was who, because even sometimes women and children were armed in the Vietnam War. So eventually we'll have to pull out of the war, and the U.S. and the North Vietnam are going to sign an agreement. Vietnam was unified as a communist state in 1975, and today Vietnam remains a communist country with a free market. They have free market elements in its economy. So that's why, like, people go to travel to Vietnam from America because they have a free market, very similar to China. So here's some pictures. There were lots of protests at home at many universities because the Vietnam War used the draft. So that meant any male that was 18 and older could be pulled into the war. This was one of the first televised wars, so people had strong opinions about it because, the death toll was put on the television every day. There were clips of helicopters and men being shot and fighting, napalm, Agent Orange, which was a chemical that was dropped to eradicate the forest or the jungle vegetation in Vietnam, but it also caused humans to have deformities, like babies in Vietnam were born with deformities. American men came back and later had cancer in their life due to Agent Orange. So it's very horrific war. So in 1967, I'm kind of switching gears. We're going to have the 6-Day War. This is going to deal with the Middle East. So I'm kind of switching gears, moving from Asia to the Middle East. The Soviet wants to give misinformation to Israel. Or no, they're giving misinformation saying that Israel's going to attack Syria. So Syria says, we need assistance from Egypt. So Israel attacks Syria, Egypt, and eventually Jordan. Israel wins. And what's going to eventually happen is that the 6-Day War is going to kind of open up the door for Israel to kind of start taking over more of that original country called Palestine. And so there will be a group that forms called the PLO. And the PLO is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They are considered a terrorist group because they fight and blow up Israelis and people from Israel because they want their country back. So if you look, in 1967, this is Israel before the 6-Day War. And here's Israel under Israeli control after the 6-Day War. So if you look, these areas are going to expand. So the orange is going to be Israel. The green is going to be full Palestinian control. And then when you look over here, the West Bank is partial Palestinian control and then occupied by Israel. So what you have to understand is that the Israelis are going to expand. And so that's going to be a little bit more difficult for the Palestinians because they were originally there. So last thing we're going to talk about until we get to the 1970s is apartheid. In the 1960s, apartheid is going to be created in South Africa. Apartheid stands for apartness. And so what happens in South Africa during this time is that they establish 4 racial groups: white, black, mixed, and Asian. Asian is predominantly Indians that came to work in the salt mines. So they had segregation, and there were restrictions on several things: land ownership, marriage, identity, books, travel, voting, and homelands. Many white South Africans, when apartheid was established, took land and all of these things. So they required black South Africans, mixed, and Asians to carry identification books. They could not marry white South Africans. They did not own their land, even though they were the original people of the land. And with apartheid, you're going to have a man named Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was a black South African who wore many hats in his life. Like, he was even a boxer for a while, but Nelson Mandela was a lawyer. And so he tried to fight apartheid, which was a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination in South Africa that ran from 1948 to 1991. When Nelson Mandela became powerful in the 1960s, they imprisoned Nelson Mandela for 27 years. But during that time, the ANC, which is the African National Congress, fought against apartheid. And so when Nelson Mandela was released in 1991, Nelson Mandela eventually, by 1994, became the first black South African president. So it's an amazing, turnaround. It's a full circle for him. And if you want to know more about it, you need to look at your documents in your course pack because it's amazing. All right, this is all that I have.